friends. Welcome to the Three Pillars podcast with your host, Griselda Barreto. Aviation. Today's guest is Tim van Beveren. Tim van Beveren is a journalist, photographer, cameraman, and filmmaker. He has been involved in the media industry for more than 30 years and has played an important role as author, director, and co-worker in the development of several award-winning film and television productions, including the German Federal Film Award, New York Festivals, International Great Lakes Film Festival, and others. Since the end of the 1980s, he has also reported from crises and war zones like the popular uprising in Nepal in 1989, Kurdistan and Afghanistan. He accompanied the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and former Federal Chancellor Willy Brandt at the end of 1990 on his successful humanitarian mission to Iraq in order to reach the release of the Germans and other citizens of dictator Saddam Hussein who were kept in strategic sites as human shields. He reported as a correspondent on behalf of private and public TV providers from the crises area of the Gulf and later the Balkan conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Van Beveren himself became a direct witness to the conflicts of the modern era. From 1998 to 2005, he lived and worked as a TV and print correspondent in the USA. Since 2008, though, he lives in Berlin. In 1986, Tim van Beveren was nominated for the Max Ophüls Award and in 1988 for the Federal Film Award for participating in Das Drehbuch. In 1996, he won the gold medal at the New York Festivals for the TV documentary Fear is Included in the Airfare, A Crash and Its Consequences. In 2015, he won a total of 4 international awards for the documentary Unfiltered Breathe It In, The Truth About Aerotoxic Syndrome. In 2016 and 2017, he was awarded with several honorable mentions by IPA and Monochrome Awards. In 2018, he won the Best Documentary Made by or About Women at a Live Doc International Festival at Los Angeles for Women Composers. In 2019, he won the Best Documentary Feature at the 10th World Music and Independent Film Festival at Washington, D.C. for Women Composers. Hi, Tim. Welcome to the Three Pillars. I'm so glad to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Well, fine. Peachy, to say so.
All right, cool. I'm really honored to have you on the show. And before we start, could I ask you to tell our listeners a little bit more about you?
About me. Well, for more than half a century, I used the upright walk. I belong to no political party or any lobbying institution, and I'm not good at all in being a suppository. And after some 30 years ago, I studied law, and then I got interested in journalism. I worked at some media outlets at our former German capital at Bonn, and then I was fed up with law and why Mr. Smith is suing Mrs. Smith or vice versa, and I decided to study art in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I made my first movie picture about a very hot topic those days. It was the extradition of political refugees. And I brought it to the movie theaters, and I started to do documentaries and current affair programs for German television. And I ended up in some areas being subject to civil unrest and war, such as Nepal, former Yugoslavia, Iraq, and others, until I thought that my guardian angel had too much overtime and was too stressed, and I should not take such risks any longer. So I got married to the wrong woman, became father of a great daughter, which is the only good thing from this time, got divorced, got a job offer in the US as a correspondent for Swiss media, later got a green card there and started to work in a variety of different fields. And having been a freelancer for most of the time, I thought it was useful to stand on more than only one leg. So I moved from my previous field of expertise, which was illegal arms trade, to something I always loved since my early childhood and my teenager time, which was aviation, and especially aviation safety. And knowing how airplanes work and also the systems around it, and I mean the industry as it as includes the regulatory bodies and so on, I thought this is much better and worthwhile. So, especially because I thought that in those days that there is a specific ethic involved here, especially when it comes to safety, which is share your experience. You can commit to errors in a non-punitive environment and thereby help improving our high safety standards, which we have so far. So, and well, it took me then some time to discover that these former code of ethics that the former generation of aviators were so proud of has become very much of a Swiss cheese, and that with the deregulation of aviation in the 80s, another dogma has become very prominent in this industry, which is shareholder value and greed. So that's basically a short synopsis of my life.
Wow, that's really, really impressive. I mean, your experience is so richly varied. What from from all that you've done, what speaks to you the most? Would it be journalism or aviation or coaching or directing? I also know that you've worked for law firms where you have actually sought compensation for the relatives of victims after crashes. So all these careers are pretty interesting. Which one speaks to you the most from all of them?
Hmm. Well, it's hard to say. It's I strongly believe that journalism, that when conducted to proper standards and again to ethics, have a very good potential to initiate a change in regard to grievances. But we do also see an unfortunate change here lately as well in regards to fake news and journalists being compromised by corruption, but also by, well, you may call it ignorance or sometimes even political parameters imposed by those who run certain departments or editors in chief, so the responsible decision makers. So it has become worse lately as the older generation of very experienced editors and unbiased editors has reached their retirement age, and their positions have been substituted with people from the generation which I call the generation indifference. This doesn't mean that these are acting on a certain intent. Not at all. They are all subject to changes in education that we have seen in the past and over the past decades. And on many occasions, they simply don't know it any better. Well, but that is not an excuse. Then, when it comes to real showdown scenarios, how we call them in journalism, for example, with a big wealthy individual or enterprise, and the publication is facing threats from the legal department of such entities, these media decision makers tuck their tail between the legs and start to ease down the accusations. So that has become very prominent in the past. And it seems that they have not understood that one of the most important principles in our political world as of today is that democracy is not something given and is not just being there for eternity. It's something that you have to fight for every day and in every corner and angle, and you have to defend it. And this is a day-to-day job, similar to aviation, where safety is not a given fact. Yeah, you have to work on safety and create it every day. You have to create this safety net around each and every flight. This is nothing which is just given, and it's not God given. So this all has to be defended by all means, and this requires sometimes that people gather, build networks, and use their power by pulling into one, and I mean in the same direction, to make a change. And this sometimes works quite well when it comes to litigation, for example. And here is one of my other foot standing,
Mhm.
especially in the Anglo-American court system, because there we have the punitive damages. There, in most cases, also the information becomes completely public. Court files can be read and researched by everybody. They can be quoted. In the EU, what we see here is a strong tendency to obscure this, and especially when it comes to litigation against big key players. So that's why I always appreciated to work for law firms, especially when it comes to cases where compensation of victims' families after crashes are involved, and especially if this crash happened because of violations of the previous code of conduct in the aviation industry.
Mm. And has it always turned out positive? I mean, have you always won the cases? And how long did it take you?
Well, that depends. Sometimes it goes real quick. Sometimes it goes over years. But so far, all cases that I have been involved in against the aviation industry were cases that were won.
That's great. And is it stressful? I'm presuming it is.
It's stressful, yes, it is. And one of the points is you don't make many friends. You
Yeah.
make friends with lawyers, and well, you come very close to these families of the victims. But I think it's worth doing it.
Mm. Did you get involved? I mean, did you get emotionally involved with these cases, or did you at a certain point say, I have to stay out of it? Because if I get too involved, I might hurt from it?
Well, that applies also to journalism. You have to try to not get emotionally involved, because otherwise it kills you. Because especially when we're looking at subjects like this one here, aerotoxic syndrome, you see a lot of people who are really suffering, and this is not good. So you have to keep a certain distance. But that doesn't mean that you should not have an attitude towards the issue that you're reporting about or you're dealing with. And therefore, sometimes it's helpful to understand the situation of those people you're fighting for.
Yeah, amazing. Coming back now to 1996. So I read that you won a gold medal at the New York Festival for the TV documentary Fear is Included in the Airfare, A Crash and Its Consequence. Tell us about your journey with that project.
Well, this is exactly one of these specific examples where both go together. You may remember that in February 1996, a Boeing 757 belonging to the Turkish charter carrier Beveren crashed shortly after takeoff from the Dominican Republic, and all 189 souls on board perished.
Hmm.
There were 167 German passengers, and that was making it the worst aviation accident for Germany. It was said that it was due to a classical pilot error. What happened there is that one of the speed indicators was giving wrong values, most likely because of a problem with the sensor. And the crew noticed that when they started their takeoff roll, and they could have safely aborted the takeoff at that point in time. But the captain decided to continue his takeoff roll, and when then later on climbing out through 6,000 feet, the wrong speed indicator triggered an overspeed warning, telling the crew, danger, you're flying too fast. But that only 10 seconds later was followed by the opposite warning, a stall warning. That's when you're flying too slow and you're approaching the critical point where your wings will not create enough of the required lift force to stay in the air. So the crew was totally confused, having these opposite warnings, and which also require action in two opposites way. So they were really confused. And on top of this, there was another issue with one of the automated systems kicking in and counteracting on all the efforts for recovery by the crew. So they were doomed. And I started my research at the place of the accident in the Dominican Republic. I went to Puerto Plata and I met with the investigator in charge, a very nice major of the Dominican Republic's Air Force, who, what I discovered, had one obstacle. His English language knowledge was very, very limited. He was speaking Spanish, but he couldn't read an English manual, for example. Also, the Dominican Republic had no experience in investigating such a major accident. So they called in the big brother, in this case, the US and its National Transportation Safety Board, to help. But the help was not provided from one of the top notches there in Washington, D.C. It was some subordinate at the local Miami office. And major errors were made already. For example, when they were transcribing the cockpit voice recorder and translating it from Turkish, the crew was speaking Turkish to English. And also, I got the impression that it was somehow set that the airplane and its manufacturer, Boeing, should not be at fault at all here. But unfortunately, only 8 months later, another Boeing 757 crashed shortly after departure at Lima, Peru, and the causes pointed to a very similar problem, confusing the crew, and another 70 people were killed. Well, when the Bergen Air accident happened here in Germany, all hell broke loose. The media went outrageous. The government took cover and left the relatives for themselves. For example, there was a search and recovery operation conducted to get the recorders from the bottom of the ocean, and that cost a fortune. And Germany has spent a lot of money, put a lot of money into this special submarine to go down there and get the recorders out. So several millions of euros were spent there. And they located the wreckage and retrieved the recorders. And they also took video image, and video image shows that there were still bodies strapped in the seats in the center fuselage, as well as the bodies of the pilots in the cockpit section, which was sheared off there. But no efforts were made to retrieve these bodies. And when I then interviewed for the documentary the responsible state secretary in the German Ministry of Transport for our TV production, he said, well, at sea burial is a common way of funeral, isn't it? So I asked him, well, sure, sir, but did you ask the relative of the deceased if this is their wish? And this is where the interview was over at this point in time. So also, the Germans then suddenly became aware that there is a major difference in regards to mandatory insurance and compensation, whether you crash in a commercial regular scheduled flight or with a charter carrier. While for scheduled flight, there was a minimum of some 300,000 euros per victim. The compensation for the victim of a charter carrier was limited to 25,000 euros those days. The underlying laws and the international treaty were dating back to, I believe, 1912, and they were intended for the victims of accidents with ships and were never changed. So we did tell all this in the documentary, and which thereby became sort of a patchwork feature. And this documentary then was awarded at the New York festivals with the gold medal, and that was the first time ever that a German-produced TV documentary received this award. I was then contacted by the German state prosecutor at Frankfurt, who had the problem that he had to conduct an investigation into the cause of the accident because the first human remains from the crash at the Dominican Republic reached Germany at the international airport in Frankfurt, and therefore he had the case. So I took that job, and I strongly recommended to him in my final report that he should start an investigation against the aircraft manufacturer because of negligence. Because we did find out that there have been numerous close calls and warning signs at the horizon prior to the crash, but Boeing did do nothing to at least inform the pilots on how to cope with such a situation. And that was something I so far was used to only by Boeing's big counterpart, the Airbus consortium. But the prosecutor was using his easy way out, and he buried the case, and end of story. The complete opposite then happened with a law firm representing the victim families of the crash in Lima, Peru, that I mentioned earlier, which happened 8 months after the Beveren crash. Then, rather than just threatening Boeing to file suit, they went ahead and filed in the court of Miami. And I was in Miami those days, and I worked as an expert with them. And the flight originated from Miami, so they had an open door there to the court system and the US jurisdiction. And I recall that it took Boeing some 6 hours after the suit was filed and on the record, therefore, to come up with the first offer towards the families. Of course, without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing or guilt, but they paid 300,000 US dollars voluntarily per victim. And I believe in the end some millions were paid, but the exact amount is part of a confidentiality agreement, like usual in this area.
Wow, amazing. What a story. So you documented all this in the documentary, even the Peru one, or that was later after the documentary was released?
That was after the documentary was released, yeah.
Okay, but probably they used your documentary as proof, I'm presuming.
Well, we had the investigation there, and for example, yeah, it
Mm.
turned out that Boeing was aware of the problem that some major U.S. carriers had changed their manuals for the Boeing 757 to cope with such a situation, but Boeing never changed their manufacturer manual, which is the Bible, to say so. Yeah, that's what is approved by the FAA. That's what all the airlines have. Well, if you're a big airline like Lufthansa or British Airways, you can write your own manuals, and they sometimes do. But you normally stick to the original manufacturer's manual. But here we found out that other airlines were aware they had the same problems, and they changed the manual, and they informed their pilots. But these pilots were flying with Boeing manuals. That was the problem.
Yeah. So that's error, human error, right?
Well, it's always called pilot error, but that's the point. It's not always the pilot.
Yeah.
You have to look very carefully into this.
Okay, Tim, let's go to you writing books. I know that you've written quite a few books on aviation safety in the early 90s, and I believe another one in 2005. What is your take on the present numerous crashes that we are seeing taking place involving the Boeing 737-800 MAX?
Well, this particular case is very similar to what played a role in the Bergen Air crash. Similar in the way that there is a known safety relevant deficiency with a vital system of the aircraft, and this was not properly rectified, nor were the pilots flying these aircraft properly informed and trained to cope with such a situation. Since Airbus has introduced very sophisticated computer systems in today's aviation in the 80s, the role of the pilot has more and more become the role of a system observer and an operator. And fly-by-wire technology and computers are very fine as long as everything runs smooth and as foreseen by the engineers. And this is the case in 90% of the day-by-day operation. But there is one fundamental difference when it comes to this man and machine interfaces and its differences. While a computer will repetitively do what the system was programmed to do, even if there is a glitch in it, man is able to learn. So pilots can be trained and conditioned to cope even with very unusual situations. And they will thereby avoid to make the same mistake again and again. But this requires good pilots and a lot of reoccurring training for them and information. And this information has to come quick and fast. This is one side of the medal. On the other side is the inglorious tendency, which is ongoing for quite some decades already, that more and more responsibility is shifted away from government authorities, who previously had the 100% oversight about everything that had to do with aviation, be it development of and design of new aircraft, of engines or components for aircraft. So basically also oversight over the manufacturers, up to each and every mechanic and technician who puts his hands on an aircraft in order to repair or exchange a component. Today, this oversight and the responsibility has been shifted to the airlines, to the maintenance organization, and vastly to the manufacturers themselves. And here with the Boeing 737 MAX, it was shifted completely from the overseeing authority, the Federal Aviation Administration, to Boeing. So thereby also a very important safety net was eroded, and bang, an accident happened. But rather than stepping full speed in here, the FAA leaned back and left it to Boeing to deal with the issue. And bang, the second crash. And reluctantly, then there was a worldwide grounding imposed. And now I believe everybody is busy in cleaning up the mess. And as I see it, an absolutely unnecessary accident followed by another, and all because of economic well-being of a major key player in the game, Boeing in this case. And see, it's quite simple in this regard. As I always say, if you want to know the cost of safety, try an accident. Boeing has, with this accident, lost its credibility and everything that the company stood for, and it was just because of one accident too much. I'm pretty much convinced that tomorrow it could also happen to any of their competitors or to Airbus, because these deficiencies, with the lack of oversight by the respective government authorities, we have the same in Europe. Yeah, the oversight by EASA is very much on the same level as in the US. Or in other words, well, if you shift the oversight, to give you an example, yeah, if you shift oversight for, let's say, all financial transactions to the banks, you should not be puzzled when they rip you off big time. And the unfortunate thing we see here again, it's shareholder value has become the mantra of all industry activities, and they seem to give a shit if this is to the benefit of mankind or not. As long as they can squeeze profits out of something, they will do, and as long as law enforcement and politicians fail to address such wrongdoing in an appropriate manner, this will continue and even become worse. That I'm very convinced of that. And are you aware of any CEO responsible for causing any harm to hundreds or even thousands of people who finally went to jail, be it in aviation or the tobacco industry, the pharmaceutical industry, banks or brokers? Do
No,
you know any?
no.
No, me neither. Is there ever any responsible politician being charged for his or her negligence in addressing an issue that had a negative impact upon his or her citizens? I'm not aware of any of this. I believe the last time in cultivated Europe that was during the French Revolution, when they ended up on the guillotine and probably in the Nuremberg trials.
So how do we change the system? I mean, what can we do, from where we are standing right now? What action can we take to bring a change in the system? It's pretty difficult, isn't it?
I would say it's impossible because this is out of our scope. Normal, let's say, well, the unions could have some impact, but the unions are teethless tigers. Yeah, whenever they dare to stand up, somebody calls, oh, we will lay off staff or we have to cut costs and and they are silent. And the other would be passengers, but passengers have no proper representation. They are not organized. They have no lobby to speak so, or which deals with their interests. So it's a catch-22 situation.
Yeah. And tell me something, Tim. How can the listeners get their hands on your books that you've written?
Well, the books are unfortunately out of print. You can get them in the antiquariats sometimes. They are with a couple of libraries. The Library of Congress has them in the US,
Hmm.
as I donated it to them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and probably it will be an electronic version there. Well, the films you can get online via Vimeo and Vimeo on demand channel, where, for
Mhm.
example, you can get Unfiltered Breathed In. I
Okay.
sent you the links for that.
Yeah, good. I'll put that on the description of this episode. So if the listeners
Yeah,
want to watch the film, they can actually get to the description there.
yeah.
Let's go a bit ahead then, Tim, to 2011. You were one of the experts testifying in a non-public hearing in the German parliament. What happened there, and has there been a change initiated since, at least in Germany?
Well, there's some, let's say, some awareness in Germany, and there's some awareness with some few politicians. One is very active in this. He's from the Green Party. His name is Markus Tressel, and he, since 2011, keeps on digging on the German government. He's asking every year how many cases have been reported, what happened, how many people were injured, how many medical reports do we have, and things like that. But what was initiated shortly after this non-public hearing, that was a motion for a law that was kicked out by the governing party. Those days it was the Christian Democrats and the Liberals. Yeah, what happened there? Well, we found out that there was a very close call with the German wings Airbus A320 landing in Cologne, which had a fume event where the pilot really hardly managed to get the plane down to the ground, and full loaded plane narrowly escaped the disaster. That case was not investigated. It was investigated when it was mentioned in this non-public hearing, but then it was also buried. The investigator in charge was changed in the middle of the investigation because apparently the guy was going too much into the right direction, and then it was blamed on the pilot. So the usual stuff. So unfortunately, there has not been much. But there was a hearing, and well, I think I prepared the most comprehensive and voluminous document for this. It was a document of about a couple of 30 pages, but more than 1,200 pages of evidence attached to it, which I just sent to the parliament because this goes to the library of the parliament, and thereby it's on the record. So thereby nobody can say in 10 or 20 years we didn't know about this. So they have all the medical studies that were published in 2011, and they should do something. But I'm not convinced that this is an avenue where really a change will happen unless a major accident happens and is attributed to a fume event.
Mm. Okay. Now let's go to this beautiful documentary that you made that I saw and that I thought was a gem, a hidden gem. In 2015, you won a total of 4 international awards for the documentary Unfiltered Breathed In: The Truth About Aerotoxic Syndrome. What inspired you to make this documentary?
Hmm, that's a long story. Well,
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I started in 2008, and that was when I started dealing with this issue. And those days for my former major commissioning TV station, WDR in Cologne. And with the support of the editor in charge there for this program, we were able to conduct a very intense and, I have to say, top-notch research before we broadcasted the first current affair programs on this issue in early 2009 it was. So since that time, my senior editor and I were convinced that in order to properly address the topic, a full-time documentary is required rather than a 5 to 8 minutes piece, which you usually see in these current affairs programs. But the commissioning editor of WDR's documentary programming, certain Mr. Jo Angerer, didn't like this idea at all, and he rejected it a couple of times. So we continued with more short reportages and the slots that we had available. And then we had a change in the top editorial management of WDR. Mrs. Sonja Mikic became chief editor, and she had commissioned me before to report about aerotoxic syndrome in her primetime investigative program, Monitor. And she called me in her office in late 2012, I think it was, and told me about her future plan to establish an investigative team working in a combined manner with another German TV station, NDR from Hamburg, and the famous Süddeutsche Zeitung. And she told me that this documentary should fulfill higher standards and be on the same level as we are used to see it with the primetime BBC documentaries. So this film should be one of the pilot projects for this new established investigative resort. And I told her that this could be done, as we have established a pretty good network to obtain data and evidence over the years, and that is not so complicated then. So I then learned about the case of Richard Westgate, a former British Airways pilot who at the time was undergoing medical treatment in Holland and was connected to Dr. Michel Mulder. And Westgate and I agreed on a personal meeting in Holland shortly after Christmas 2012, so between Christmas and New Year's. And then a few days prior to Christmas, Dr. Mulder called me and told me that Richard was dead. An investigation is ongoing, including a forensic analysis of his body. So this was mainly because Richard did expressively wish for that in case of his death, as he understood that the really required hard evidence can only be found in his body tissues, his nerves, and maybe his brain. It was basically his wish that this is conducted. And so his will was also accompanied by the demand that an independent journalistic documentation should be done about that. And that's how the story started. So I told that to my editors there in WDR, and they agreed that this is a subject that we should follow.
Please join us next week for the conclusion to the Tim van Beveren podcast interview. Thank you for joining the 3 Pillars. Please subscribe at griselda.blog to win a free protective mask. See you next week.